The air crackled with tension. Inside the White House, every conversation was hushed. Every glance exchanged between staffers was loaded with worry. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by a sense of dread, as if everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Aides rushed through the halls, faces grim and determined. Their footsteps echoed off the marble floors, a constant reminder that time was running out. Phones rang off the hook, and urgent memos were passed from hand to hand. The sense of urgency was palpable, as if the very walls of the West Wing were closing in. The White House, usually a place of measured calm and careful deliberation, was in full-blown crisis mode. Senior advisors huddled in emergency meetings, voices raised in heated debate. The press room buzzed with speculation, reporters desperate for any scrap of information. The reason? America's ports, the arteries of its economic lifeblood, were shutting down. These ports, which handled billions of dollars in goods every day, had ground to a halt. The ripple effects were already being felt across the nation, from small businesses to major corporations. This wasn't a drill. This was a full-blown logistical nightmare unfolding in real time. Alarms blared in control rooms, and government officials scrambled to coordinate a response. Every minute that passed meant more goods delayed, more businesses at risk, and more pressure on the administration to act. Ships laden with goods were stranded at sea, unable to unload their cargo. Dozens of massive container ships bobbed just offshore, their crews anxiously awaiting orders. The supply chain, already stretched thin, was now on the verge of snapping. Trucks sat idle, their drivers left wondering when, or if, they'd be back on the road. Parking lots filled with rows of stationary semis, engines off, as drivers gathered in small groups, sharing rumors and fears about what might come next. At the heart of this crisis was a breakdown in negotiations between the people who move America's goods, the dock workers, and the companies that employ them. Years of simmering tensions over wages, working conditions, and job security had finally boiled over, leading to a standoff that neither side seemed willing to end. Months of talks had collapsed, leaving both sides entrenched and angry. Union leaders accused management of refusing to bargain in good faith, while executives blamed the unions for holding the economy hostage. The atmosphere was toxic, with little hope for a quick resolution. The stakes couldn't be higher. Every day the ports remained closed, the threat to the U.S. economy grew. Shelves in stores began to empty, factories slowed production, and Wall Street watched nervously as the crisis deepened. The entire nation was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. And for the president, already facing low approval ratings, this crisis had the potential to define his legacy. With cameras flashing and the world watching, he stepped up to the podium, knowing that his next words and his next actions could shape the future of the country for years to come. For months, the message from the dockworkers had been clear, loud, persistent, and impossible to ignore. They were overworked, underpaid, and pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond their control. The daily grind had become unbearable, and their patience was wearing thin. The pandemic had only intensified their struggles, pushing them to their absolute limits. It exposed the fragility of the global supply chains they worked so hard to keep running. Every day, they faced new risks, new uncertainties, and the constant fear of bringing illness home to their families. Yet they showed up, day after day, to keep the world moving. They had risked their health, working long, grueling hours, often late into the night, just to keep America supplied and afloat. Many missed family milestones, birthdays, and holidays, sacrificing their own well-being for the greater good. Now, after months of sacrifice, they wanted what they felt was rightfully theirs: respect, recognition, and fair compensation. Their demands were simple and reasonable: better pay, improved working conditions, and a seat at the table when decisions were made. They wanted safer workplaces, more predictable schedules, and the dignity that comes from being treated as essential, not expendable. Above all, they wanted a greater share of the record profits being raked in by the shipping companies, profits that had soared during the crisis, even as workers struggled to make ends meet. The contrast was stark: modest paychecks for the workers, luxury for the executives. But the employers, citing their own economic pressures and uncertainties, pushed back hard. Negotiations dragged on, with both sides digging in. The talks stalled, then sputtered, and finally collapsed altogether, leaving both parties at an impasse and the future uncertain. The breakdown was about more than just money or contracts. It spoke to a growing divide in America, a widening gap between those who do the work and those who reap the rewards. It reflected a sense that the workers who form the backbone of the nation were being left behind, their contributions overlooked and undervalued. The dock workers felt invisible, their sacrifices taken for granted by those in power. This strike, they hoped, would finally make their voices heard, shining a spotlight on their struggles and forcing the nation to reckon with the true cost of keeping the economy moving. For them, this was more than a labor dispute. It was a fight for dignity, justice, and a better future. The pressure on the White House was immense. Business leaders, fearing economic catastrophe, urged the president to intervene, to use the power of his office to force a resolution. Some called for him to invoke the Taft-Hartley Act, a controversial law that would allow the government to break the strike. But such a move would be deeply unpopular with unions, a key part of the president's base. He was caught between a rock and a hard place, forced to choose between averting economic disaster and alienating a core constituency. For now, the White House was trying to walk a tightrope. They urged both sides to return to the negotiating table, offering to act as mediators, but their pleas were falling on deaf ears. The anger and mistrust ran too deep. The impact of the port closures was felt almost immediately. Supermarkets, once overflowing with produce from around the world, started to see gaps on their shelves. The exotic fruits and vegetables that had become staples were the first to go, followed by imported cheeses, wines, and specialty items. As the days turned into weeks, the shortages became more acute. Basic goods, once taken for granted, were suddenly in short supply. The price of everything, from gasoline to clothing to toys, began to creep upwards. Inflation, already a concern, threatened to spiral out of control. For ordinary Americans, the crisis was a stark reminder of how reliant they were on the smooth functioning of global trade. The things they bought, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, all depended on a complex web of ships, ports, and workers, a web that had now been ripped apart. The port closures exposed a deep rift in American society, laying bare tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. What began as a labor dispute quickly grew into a national crisis, forcing Americans everywhere to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, economics, and the future of work in the country. On one side were those who sympathized with the dock workers, who saw the strike as a justified response to years of exploitation and broken promises. For them, the picket lines represented not just a fight for better wages, but a stand against a system that seemed to value profits over people. Supporters argued that the workers deserved a bigger slice of the pie, that corporate greed had gone too far, and that the sacrifices made by laborers were too often overlooked. They pointed to rising inequality, stagnant wages, and the growing gap between executives and everyday employees as evidence that change was long overdue. On the other side were those who viewed the strike as reckless and self-defeating, a move that threatened to unravel the fragile threads holding the economy together. They pointed to the economic damage it was causing, businesses forced to close their doors, supply chains grinding to a halt, and families struggling to put food on the table as shelves emptied and prices soared. Critics argued that the workers' demands were unreasonable, that by refusing to compromise, they were holding the nation hostage and risking the livelihoods of millions who depended on the flow of goods. The debate played out everywhere, on cable news, across social media feeds, in classrooms, and in living rooms across the country. Friends and families found themselves divided, each side convinced of the righteousness of their cause. At its core, it was a debate about fairness, about the role of labor in a globalized economy, and about the very soul of America. It forced the nation to ask, who gets to share in prosperity? What do we owe to those who keep the country running, often behind the scenes? And as the days dragged on, it became clear that there were no easy answers, only hard choices, and a nation more divided than ever before. The crisis in America's ports was just one symptom of a much larger problem. All over the world, the delicate threads of the global supply chain were fraying. The pandemic had exposed its fragility, and now, as economies roared back to life, it was struggling to cope with the surge in demand. From the ports of Los Angeles, to the factories of China, to the warehouses of Europe, the system was creaking under the strain. Labor shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and soaring energy prices were creating a perfect storm, leading to delays, shortages, and rising costs. The situation was a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of the global economy, and of the risks inherent in relying on a system stretched to its breaking point. As the standoff continued, the pressure on all sides intensified. The White House, facing mounting economic and political pressure, knew that time was running out. They needed to find a solution, and fast. But the path forward was far from clear. The dockworkers, emboldened by their success in bringing the nation to a standstill, seemed in no mood to back down. The employers, facing pressure from shareholders and customers, were hesitant to give in to demands they saw as unreasonable. The future of the American economy, and perhaps even the political fate of the president, hung in the balance. The world watched and waited, holding its breath, as the clock ticked down to a resolution, one way or another.